Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the Johnson edition. We are now at poem 201, Two Swimmers Wrestled on the Spar. And right away, this poem is going to have so much history to it because of the way that it was in fact presented. It came as another Sam Boyle's letter. The letter actually began with the words, "I can't explain," and then the poem itself was produced, which obviously has led any number of us to enjoy that she herself couldn't explain it. Why? Well, there's probably some disclosure challenges here, but even beyond that fact, there's maybe the fact that Emily at times wasn't even sure she herself was always able to explain her poetry, and obviously we're trying to do that very thing, so there's a bit of irony here, no doubt. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've already exposed yourself to our set of introductory comments as well as our preceding 200 poems that we've already studied. When you sit and read the Johnson edition all the way through and you get to poem 201 here, and you've studied all these earlier poems, you then do have a point of reference to say, a number of times there has been this longing, this crying, this cry for what? For love, for acceptance, desire for some kind of understanding. And many have read this poem as a really kind of sad, anguish-ridden type of offering. Now, in 1860, the Harvard editors of Emily's poetry were ready to say that at the time this poem was written, that a, quote, turbulent emotional experience must have occurred. Now, what that was, of course, has led to all kinds of speculation. Here, we're back to the shipwreck metaphor that we often see, the wrestling metaphor. We've seen this already in poem 59. You'll remember with Genesis 32, Jacob wrestling with the angel and all of that. But there's a lot of different ways to interpret this poem as we get into it. Possibly wrestling with faith, for example. Emily will have been exposed to the Reverend Charles Wadsworth's, this Presbyterian minister that Dickinson followed closely and loved him very much. In his sermon, The Great Query, he uses some imagery that similarly sounds much like this poem. He says it this way, quote, he says, "To the poor lost soul, there shall be no tomorrow. The spar," that part of the mast, right, the top part of the mast, which you're hanging onto if you're in shipwreck, "the spar will be washed away from the grasp of the shipwrecked man ere the sun rise up again to shine upon his sea-tossed head." And then Emily herself would say in a letter of 28 March 1846 to Abia Palmer Rood, quote, "I feel that I am sailing up on the brink of an awful precipice, from which I cannot escape, and over which I fear my tiny boat will soon glide if I do not receive help from above." It will then be, one reading of this poem will be this kind of wrestling with faith. It could be the loss of Sue, and some have read it that way, and we've obviously commented already in a number of poems where Emily's coming to terms with the fact that Sue chose the safe life of obviously marrying her brother as opposed to the life that Emily chose. There is as well, of course, the possibility that this poem can be read as the wrestling with the self, the divided self. Many have read it that way. Now, many have considered Sam Boyles as possibly the quote-unquote master, as we've already talked about. And is it possible that the master here has abandoned Emily to sea? She obviously said the poem, "I can't explain," and then she said this. "Two swimmers wrestled on the spar until the morning sun, when one turned smiling to the land. Oh God, the other one. The stray ships passing spied a face upon the waters born, with eyes in death, still begging, raised, and hands beseeching, thrown." Now, as we pointed out, punctuation always matters in these poems, and notice the exclamation point at the end. Again, it can be read as a cry, it can be read as an observation, although some have pointed out that for all the emotionality of this poem, there is a interesting distancing from the lost swimmer as opposed to the saved swimmer. Notice we'll begin with two swimmers. By the way, the word swimmers only gets used in all of her corpus right here in this poem. Notice the use of the word wrestling. Well, we saw it in poem 59, we saw it in poem 110, we saw it in poem 157 already. This notion of grappling, she loves that word, of wrestling, of this almost like not able to come to terms with, right? Two swimmers wrestled on the spar. And we'll see spar when we get to poem 510. It will read something like this. She'll say it this way: but most like chaos, this is at the end of the poem, but most like chaos, stopless, cool, without a chance or spar or even a report of land to justify despair. And this idea of wrestling on the spar is problematic. By the way, it's interesting that the word spar in fighting culture, of course, means to play fight. To spar is to fight, right? To wrestle. So notice two swimmers wrestled on the spar. In other words, we're in shipwreck mode here, right? And both of them, two swimmers, are holding on to the same piece of wood, we might say. Now, whether they're wrestling each other or they're wrestling the sea is not, notice here, made completely clear. But we do have until the morning sun, which obviously takes us to the Genesis 32 passage and Jacob wrestling with the angel. And of course, poem 59, as we've already said. When one turned smiling to the land, and here, of course, land is going to be safety, because that is to say, the one was able to make land. Oh God. Now it's significant that God's only mentioned in this poem one time, and it's not that it's actually God, but rather it's a euphemism, right? Like, oh my goodness type of thing. The other one, notice both capitalized, other and one. The other one, that is to say, the one who didn't make it, if you will. And then we go to stray ships. Hear all the S sounds brilliantly in this poem. The stray ships passing, spied a face, Auden's Musée des Arts, we've treated it at learnstrong.net already, that has that same notion of Virgil's Fall of Icarus. There's Icarus and the ships, delicate ships have to get by. Here it's, the stray ships passing, spied a face. So notice we go from spar to spied a face upon the waters born. In other words, didn't make it, right? With eyes in death. And then her use of the word still, we've commented on. T.S. Eliot must have learned his use of the word still from his study of Emily, right? We must be still and still moving into another intensity. You'll remember that little set of lines ends with some notion about the portress and the petrel and the ocean, right? With eyes in death, still begging, raised. Now, Emily's use of the word begging is fascinating. When we get to poems 11, we'll look at 3. When we get to poem 1152, she'll say it this way: mercy of the Almighty, begging, till his arrow sent. God, it is said, replies in person when the cry is meant. And then when we get to poem 1500, it'll run this way: it came his term to beg. The begging for the life is different from another alms. 'Tis penury in chief. And then finally at poem 1751, she'll say it this way: there comes an hour when begging stops, when the long interceding lips perceive that their prayer is vain. And of course here, notice, there was begging, there was longing for somehow to be saved, and yet, notice the eyes in death still begging, raised. It didn't happen. And hands. And then we go from, notice, begging to beseeching, throne. When we get to poem 220 here, just in a few minutes, she'll say it this way for her use of beseeching, her only other use of it in her poems: could I then shut the door, lest my beseeching face at last rejected be of her? Some have put these two poems together of 201 and poem 220 and said, well, here we're talking really about the loss of Sue, who took the safe course, right, and went to land by marriage. And of course, Emily did not do it that way. And hands beseeching, throne. 8 different poems will use this notion of the word throne, this use of the word throne. Notice kind of tossed aside, almost like carelessly tossed aside. Well, that's the poem. What are we going to do with it in 2a? Well, I think This is a poem about struggle. However you decide to read it, is it a struggle about faith? Is it a struggle about love? Is it a struggle about the divided self? Is it some combination of all of those? The fact that she sent it to Sam Boyles with the observation, I can't explain it, seems to suggest that she wanted to share something with him, but she was going to do it through the power of this little poem, which is obviously a provocative word picture, no question. I think the point here, though, is the struggle is always between what is safe, the land, and then maybe we would argue what is risky. I mean, think about that as it relates to love, how it can possibly relate to questions of faith and theology. Obviously, we can read this poem as a potential theodicy. Why must there be pain and suffering? Why is it that some people can't get saved? Some will go to land, others will not. And then, of course, you can even read this poem, and many have, as the struggle of the creative self. Her sending this poem to Sam Boyles could suggest that she's back to the whole notion of, should I publish, should I not publish, should I stay out there in the middle of the sea? And of course, Stevie Smith's Not Waving but Drowning, we've given full comments at learnstrong.net, comes to mind as well with a poem like this. At 2b, I love the word choices. Notice we go from spar to spied, we go from begging to beseeching, and of course the last word with the exclamation point of throne. You could argue this is the language of anguish, no doubt. At 3a, how we compare this to other titles. Well, Genesis 32, as we've said, obviously comes to mind in Jacob's wrestling, that notion that the very word Israel can be understood as those who wrestle with God, and that's obviously a point of this. I think there's a lot of Dante going on here. I think that quest to try and figure out exactly what it is that I'm going to believe and how I'm going to practice what I believe, I think is buried in this poem, as is as well St. Augustine's Confessions. That notion, go back to our comments on both, we've given full lectures on these two titles. Dante is going to teach, I think, Augustine a whole lot about this wrestling, two swimmers wrestling on the spar. Of course, Whitman, when we did all of our readings of the poems of Leaves of Grass in our talks with Walt, you'll remember that several times he played the same game of the struggling swimmer who survives or does not survive. And finally, at 3b, how do we own a poem like this? Well, a number of readers have taken this poem very, very personally, and the question I think that easily comes to mind is, what was a time in your life when you wrestled and you won, you made it to land, and a time when you did not, and there were no ships to stop to try and save you? I'm hopeful that your study of these poems is leading you to all kinds of challenges, and possibly land. Thank you.